My cousin moved into my condo 9 months before I found out he'd been sleeping with my fiancée the entire time. The worst part? My parents had known for 2 of those months and said nothing because they didn't want to ruin Christmas. I'm 33. I work as a forensic accountant for a mid-sized firm in downtown Vancouver. Which means I spend my days tracing money that doesn't want to be found, following transaction trails through layered corporate structures, flagging irregularities in financial records, building airtight documentation packages for litigation. It's not glamorous, it's methodical. You learn to stay calm when the numbers tell you something terrible. You learn to document everything before you react. You learn that emotion is what gets cases thrown out. That turned out to be the most useful skill I'd ever developed. Thea and I had been together for 4 years. She was a real estate agent. Sharp. Good at reading a room in 30 seconds. The kind of person who made you feel like the most important conversation she was having. Even when you were just talking about groceries. We'd gotten engaged at Tofino the previous October, just the 2 of us. Fog coming in off the Pacific, while we stood on Long Beach with cold feet and nowhere else to be. I'd spent 18 months setting money aside for the ring, $1,100 left over when I bought it, which I immediately put back into our joint account. Without mentioning it. That felt like the kind of thing a person building a life with someone should do. We were planning a May wedding at a vineyard, outside Kelowna in the Okanagan. The venue deposit alone was $4,500. Between the photographer, the caterer, the florist, and the DJ, we were $19,000 deep into a future that felt solid. I had rewritten my vows 3 times. I was working on the 4th version. The week everything fell apart. My cousin Morris had always been the one in the family who didn't quite find his footing. He was 29, had been doing seasonal contracting work out of Calgary. Roofing most, some renovation work in between. He wasn't a bad person, he just never built anything that lasted. When he called in February to say he'd lost his main contract, and his girlfriend had left, and he had nowhere to go, I told him he could stay in my 2nd bedroom for as long as he needed. I cleared out the closet, got him a key fob for the building, added him to the visitor parking permit. He helped with groceries occasionally. He watched hockey on the couch. He was quiet. He seemed grateful. He and Thea seemed to get along the way people do when they're both important to the same person and are making a polite effort. Surface level, pleasant, no real friction. That's what I thought I was watching. The months passed the way months pass when you're working long hours on a complex file. I left early, came home late. I made dinner for 3 people twice a week without thinking anything of it. I drove my cousin to a job interview in Burnaby in April, because his truck was in the shop. I paid his phone bill twice when he said he was short, without making it a thing. The Okanagan venue sent a payment reminder in June, and Thea and I split the next installment. We did a tasting at the caterer's kitchen and argued pleasantly about whether the salmon or the beef tenderloin was worth the price difference. She laughed at something I said in the car on the way home, and I thought, clearly, without qualification, this is the person I am going to spend my life with. I was supposed to be in Victoria until Friday. The file I'd been reviewing at the BC Securities Commission had taken 3 weeks to reach the point requiring on-site work. On Wednesday afternoon, the lead investigator located a batch of emails the client had withheld until the last possible moment. Exactly what we'd been looking for. The patterns was there. Case effectively resolved. My supervisor signed off and told me to take Thursday off. I caught the 4:30 ferry back from Swartz Bay. I didn't text Thea. I thought I'd stop at the Vietnamese place on Main Street she'd been mentioning for weeks. The one with the broth she'd had at a work lunch and talked about for 3 days afterward. Small surprise. Nothing dramatic. Her car was in the parkade when I pulled in. My cousin's truck was in visitor parking, which I registered and filed away without concern. The apartment was quiet when the elevator opened on my floor. The kind of quiet that, in retrospect, was too deliberate for 2 people who were both home. His jacket was on the hook by the door. Her keys were on the kitchen counter where she always left them. No television, no music, nothing. I heard them before I reached the hallway. Here is the thing about training yourself to stay measured in professional situations. The skill doesn't switch off when you need it personally. Your pulse goes up. Your hands stay steady. The part of your brain that processes information keeps processing information. You don't break things. You think about evidence, about documentation, about what you'll need later, and what you cannot afford to contaminate. I stood in the hallway for about 10 seconds. Then I walked back to the front door, put my shoes on and left. I sat in my car in the parkade for 2 hours. I thought about the ferry crossing. I thought about the case file I'd just closed. I thought about Thea's face at the caterer's tasting, and my cousin, passing the salt across the dinner table at my parents' house. At Christmas. and the check I'd written for his phone bill and the 1,800 kilometers of highway between Vancouver and Calgary that he could have stayed on. I opened my notes app and started writing down what I knew. We were still on the same family iCloud plan. My parents had set it up years ago and nobody had untangled it. Her notes synced automatically. It took 15 minutes to find what I was looking for. A folder titled with his initials. The first entry was dated mid-March. Finally, felt wrong but also inevitable. A week later, have to be more careful, he almost came home early. April, told him I love him. He said it back. Then May, 2 months before I found out, his mom knows. She wants us to wait until after the wedding. I don't know if I can keep doing this. His mom, my aunt. I took screenshots of everything. Then I opened the shared calendar we used for grocery runs. Appointment reminders, the wedding timeline. The gaps rearranged themselves once I knew what I was looking for. The Tuesday evenings Thea had said she was showing a property. The Saturday mornings my cousin went to the gym while I was working. The pattern was exactly the kind of thing I spent my professional life finding in financial records.
I just never thought to apply those skills to my own apartment.
I drove to a hotel in Gastown and paid cash for 3 nights. By the time I reached the room I had 64 missed calls between Thea, my cousin and my mother. I put the phone face down on the nightstand and went to sleep. In the morning, I moved through the documentation like a case file. My personal checking account at RBC had always been separate from the joint account we held at TD Bank. I transferred my contributions from the joint account, every dollar, verified against 18 months of statements, into my personal account, not a cent more than what was mine. I froze both our credit bureau files. I called the property management company about removing a co-occupant from the lease. Then I called my firm's HR coordinator in the Toronto office. 7 months earlier, the firm had offered me a senior associate position in Toronto. I'd turned it down because Thea didn't want to leave Vancouver, didn't want to rebuild her client base from scratch, didn't want to start over somewhere new. I asked HR if the position was still available. There was a pause. Then she said she'd need to check with the partners. She called back in 2 hours. The position had been kept informally open. Could I provide a start date by end of week? I told her I'd confirm by Friday. My mother called from my aunt's number on Thursday. She'd figured out I'd blocked the others. She said there was a family conversation that needed to happen. And could I come to my parents' place in Burnaby on Sunday? Her voice had the particular quality of someone reading from a script they'd been handed rather than written. Careful. Prearranged. The outcome had already been decided. Some part of me still needed to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with. So I went. The living room had been rearranged. My cousin and Thea were on the main couch. My aunt and uncle were on the love seat. My mother was in the armchair by the window. My father stood at the edge of the kitchen doorway, barely inside the room. As though he might need to leave it quickly, a single dining chair had been brought in from the kitchen and positioned. Facing all of them. I stayed, standing. Thea had a tissue in her hand before I'd even sat down. Not that she looked upset. More that she'd come prepared with the prop. Sit down, my mother said. I'm fine where I am. Why is she in this house? Because she's going to be part of this family. Because we need to have a real conversation about what happened. And where we go from here. My cousin stared at the floor. My aunt started in about how feelings couldn't always be controlled, and how no one had planned for any of this. Thea said she was sorry, that she and my cousin had tried to stop it. That the past 9 months had been the most painful of her life. My cousin said he still thought of me as family, and hoped that eventually we could find a way through. How long have you known? I asked my mother. She looked at my aunt. My aunt looked at the table. How long? My mother adjusted the cushion beside her. We found out in May. May long weekend. I had driven out to Burnaby, and sat at their kitchen table, and talked about the Kelowna venue. And whether the rehearsal dinner should be Thursday or Friday. My mother had gotten teary looking at the draft invitation layout. My father had told a long story about the borrowed car he'd driven to his own wedding. My aunt had asked about the seating chart and whether she could bring a +1. My cousin had made coffee for everyone and passed cups around the table. They had all known. You sat at this table in May, I said. You talked about the wedding. You knew the entire time. We didn't want to ruin the holiday. And we needed to understand the full picture before you decided. Which version of events was most convenient for everyone? Thea came to us, my aunt said. She was confused. She needed guidance. We were trying to help both of them figure out the right way forward. Thea cried harder for a moment. Then something in her expression shifted, the tearful routine cooling slightly, replaced by something more calculated. This isn't entirely one-sided, she said. You worked constantly. I was alone for 2 years and you didn't notice. There it was, my fault of course. I'd worked long hours to pay for the condo we lived in. To save for the ring she'd pointed at in a window on Granville Street and said she loved. To pay the deposits on the Okanagan vineyard she'd chosen. To build the future she said she wanted. That was the reason she'd done this. My uncle was talking about forgiveness and the long view. My mother was saying that hurt people said things they didn't mean, and that I needed to give this time. My cousin said quietly that he'd never wanted to cause pain. I looked at all of them. My parents, who had protected the people who betrayed me. My aunt and uncle who had known for 2 months while I wrote Shiex and made dinner and rewrote my vows. My cousin and my fiancée, sitting close enough on the couch that their shoulders touched, looking tired. Looking sad. Looking like the victims in a story they'd written themselves. Here's what's going to happen, I said. My voice came out exactly as flat and even as I needed it to. I'm going to leave. You're all going to live with the choices you made in May and every day after it. And in about 72 hours, every person on the wedding guest list is going to receive a clear explanation for why they're not traveling to the Okanagan this spring. My mother's voice sharpened. Don't do anything you can't take back. The advice I'd give you right now, I said, is the same. I walked out. Nobody came after me. Nobody called out to apologize or ask me to wait. I listened to my own footsteps down the front walk and the sound of a normal neighborhood on a Sunday afternoon, completely indifferent to anything that had just happened inside that house. Monday morning I built the case file. Every vendor contract, every joint bank statement, every shared expense going back to February. I contacted each wedding vendor individually, clean, professional, factual, no emotion, and documented what was refundable versus forfeited. Total non-recoverable, $7,200. I put it in the loss column of the spreadsheet and moved on. Tuesday at 9 in the morning, I sent the guest notification. 131 emails. The subject line said what it needed to say. The body was 4 paragraphs. The wedding was not proceeding. The reasons were personal. Guests would be contacted regarding gifts already sent. I appreciated their understanding. I CC'd the wedding party separately with one additional line. Questions about expenses incurred should be directed to Thea. For my cousin, the relevant legal framework was the lice-or-lysine distinction under BC's Residential Tenancy Act. Because he was occupying a room within my primary residence, not a standalone tenancy, the standard 60-day notice requirement didn't apply in the same way. I gave him 14 days written notice, sent by registered mail to the condo address and to his parents' address in Surrey. I confirmed the process with the property management company, documented their confirmation, and kept copies of every piece of correspondence. For the joint lease with Thea, I began the formal removal process through property management. She had 30 days to collect her belongings and vacate. I communicated only in writing. I kept copies of everything. I filed in BC's Civil Resolution Tribunal. Small claims up to $35,000. The first filing was against Thea. $6,400, comprising her agreed-upon share of non-refundable wedding deposits, plus documented shared expenses I'd absorbed during the month she was conducting the affair. The second was against my cousin, $2,100 for groceries, parking permits, and the 2 months of phone bills. Clean paperwork, timestamp and records, joint bank statements with both names on the accounts. On Friday I confirmed the Toronto start date. The response to the guest emails came in predictable waves. Messages from people who'd known me for years, saying they were sorry and asking if I needed anything. Neutral confusion from guests navigating the gift logistics. And the third category, my mother's voicemails, my aunt's texts, messages from cousins and family contacts I hadn't spoken to in years, all carrying variations of the same script dressed in different words. Family forgives. Blood is thicker. My cousin is suffering. Thea is suffering. Won't I come back to the table? I drafted a cease and desist letter, formatted on professional letterhead, citing the applicable provisions under BC law, documenting every contact attempt with dates and times, and it's certified mail to my parents' address, with instructions it be forwarded to anyone continuing to reach out on this matter. The final line stated that further unwanted contact would be reported to the relevant authorities and documented as part of an ongoing harassment pattern. The messages slowed considerably. Thea's real estate career runs on referrals. When the trust breaks down, it breaks down without anyone having to say anything directly. It just moves through professional networks the way information always does. Quietly and efficiently. Within 3 weeks of the guest emails going out, 2 couples who'd been at our engagement party had asked to work with different agents at her firm. By October she'd left the firm entirely. By the following spring she'd relocated to a smaller operation in the Fraser Valley, starting over at a volume well below what she'd built in Vancouver. My cousin went back to Calgary by November. The lower mainland's contracting industry is small and relationship-driven. And his reputation had acquired a particular association that made things difficult. He found work there eventually. Different city, different ceiling, same pattern. I flew to Toronto in August, landed at Pearson in the rain, took the UP Express to Union Station, and walked out into a city that had absolutely no idea who I was or what had happened to me. That anonymity felt like actual oxygen. The firm put me in temporary housing in Liberty Village while I found something permanent. I settled on a one-bedroom in the annex 6 weeks later. 2 blocks from a coffee shop I liked and a subway stop I needed, and far enough from everything I'd left that it felt like a clean start. By the following spring I was leading the firm's largest Ontario file. By summer I had a senior associate title and a salary adjustment that came faster than I'd expected. I asked my manager what I'd need to do to get to the next level. He told me I was already there. I met my wife at a colleague's birthday dinner in March, at a restaurant near King Street. She's a structural engineer. Calm, precise with a dry sense of humor she deployed sparingly, and to devastating effect. We talked for 3 hours. When I walked her to her cab, she handed me her number without being asked. On our second date, she asked why I'd moved to Toronto. I told her everything, beginning to end, without softening any of it. The ferry, the parking, the hotel in Gastown, the iCloud folder with his initials, the family meeting, with the dining chair positioned in the middle of the room like I was on trial, the spreadsheet, the registered mail, all of it. I watched her face for the pity or discomfort that usually showed up somewhere in that story. Neither one arrived. When I finished, she reached across the table. "Good," she said, "you handled it right." We got married the following September in Prince Edward Island, at a farmhouse inn, outside Charlottetown that her family had been visiting for 20 years. 22 people who'd actually earned the right to be there. My sister who had called me in the first week without any qualifier attached. No but and no however. And said simply that she was sorry and that she was on my side. She was the only person in my family of origin who did. Our son was born 18 months after the wedding. He has his mother's composure. And my insistence on doing things correctly. My mother made contact 2.5 years after I'd left Vancouver. She sent the message through my father's email, which I hadn't thought to block. His note said she'd been diagnosed with a thyroid condition, manageable, good prognosis, and that she was asking for me. He said he was sorry. It was the first time any of them had used that word, directly. I called my sister and asked her to be honest with me. The diagnosis was real, and the treatment was going well, but the timing and the framing of the outreach had been coordinated by my aunt. Same dynamic as always. The family organizing behind the scenes to manage me, to find the right angle. I texted my father, "I'm glad the prognosis is good. I hope she recovers quickly." He wrote back, "She'll be devastated you're not coming." I didn't reply to that. At month 22, an anonymous email arrived at my firm address, CC'd to my supervisor and 2 senior partners. Vague accusations about my character, my personal history, the way I'd destroyed a family, and refused to take responsibility. No specifics, no evidence. Designed to be just credible enough to make people look at me differently without being verifiable enough to challenge directly. I forwarded it to HR within the hour, attached a full written summary with documentation. The affair, the family meeting, the cease and desist, every contact attempt dated and logged, and waited while IT traced the email origin to an IP address at a cafe in Surrey, near my aunt and uncle's neighborhood. They couldn't prove it was my cousin. It didn't matter. I filed a report with Surrey RCMP, not to pursue charges, but to create a paper trail connecting the email to the documented pattern of contact. I attached the incident file number to my HR record at the firm, and didn't think about it again. The email stopped. The firm sent me back to Vancouver 18 months later for a 3-day client review. I stayed near waterfront, kept my schedule tight, and told no one I was in town. On my last morning, I stopped at a cafe on Hastings I used to go to before work. Not out of any particular feeling, just habit and good espresso. My cousin was at a table by the window. He looked older than 32 had any right to look. The specific kind of tired that comes from things not working out for long enough, that you stop, expecting them to. 3 years of consequences written across him, in a way he couldn't conceal. He spotted me before I reached the counter. "Hey," he said. "Hey." He stood up, reconsidered, sat back down. "I've been wanting to say, what I did was the worst thing I've ever done in my life. I've had to live with that." "Good," I said. "That's how consequences work." He looked at me the way people look when they've finally realized you aren't bluffing. That it's actually over. "We're still cousins." "We're related," I said. "That's not the same thing." I ordered my coffee. He stayed at his table. My name was called. I picked up my cup, and I walked toward the door without looking back at him. My wife had texted while I was waiting. A photo. Our son had systematically cleared every shelf in the kitchen cupboards, and arranged the contents in a precise grid across the floor, looking enormously satisfied with his work. She'd captioned it, "He's auditing us." I stood on the sidewalk in the gray Vancouver morning and laughed. Actually laughed. The kind that comes from somewhere you forgot, was still there. My flight back to Toronto left at 2. I had 4 hours, a coffee in my hand and no particular reason to stay.